Hello, and welcome to another episode of Professional Book Girl. My name is Kayla, and I read a ton of books so that I can recommend the best to you. And it is the March wrap-up episode. I love a monthly wrap-up. I don't try to wish time away, but my favorite time of the month, if any month, is really this last few days and then the beginning. It feels like it's always a little bit of a fresh start. I clear off whenever I read a book, it goes in a pile and then they get stacked up in the order that I read them. So when I post a monthly wrap up photo, I watch that pile slowly grow throughout the month. But then obviously in the beginning of a month, it's wiped fresh. I love doing these wrap ups. I like looking back in a bit of a retrospective, which is what we're going to be doing on today's episode. So I'm going to be talking to you about, I think it is 17 books. We're going to talk about my month. I actually had a great month. We survived March, my least favorite month. Last year was probably the best March I ever had because I was in London, but I had a really great month. Before we get into that though, really quickly, looking ahead to April, our April book club pick is Right on Cue by Falon Ballard. I am so excited to read this book. I hope you guys are too. I'm a huge fan of her romance books, Lease on Love and Just My Type. This one is a Hollywood romance, which is one of my top romance tropes. That episode will be out on May 2nd, and you have until April 30th to submit your thoughts to me either at professionalbookgirlpod@gmail.com or DM them to me at Kayla or professionalbookgirl. And I've been hearing from a lot of you that you're behind on keeping up with the book club. The fun thing about doing it as a podcast is that those episodes are ready for you. So if you have or have not finished listening for the lie yet, that book club episode is live. I love that book. Very exciting that so many of you loved it as well. But let's talk about March. We survived that bitch. I've always hated March. I don't have a full specific reason for it. It's just always a vibe I've gotten literally my whole life. I also hate April though, and I hate May, but I would say March is my least favorite month. My second to least favorite is April, and my third to least favorite is May, which really just means I don't like spring. I just hate it. It's allergy season. It's so transitional. In New York, we had a few days of 70 and then it was frigid, freezing again. I'm just not a spring girl. I've talked about this a lot on the internet over the years, but I get reverse seasonal depression. Not that I'm feeling depressed, but I don't get sad and depressed in the winter like people do. I get it in the springtime, which it is a real thing that I've learned over the years. So I'm not a spring girly, but I actually did have a really good month. I was very busy. I went to a bunch of book events, which was really cool and exciting. Just last night, I'm recording this on Friday, March 29th, which is my sister's birthday. But I last night went to an event at Meta. I was at the Instagram office, which was just really wild and kind of meta for a book club chat. And it was so much fun and just so cool to be invited to an event at Instagram. I went to an event at Zando Books. I think that was in March. And then I also hosted a party. So I posted about this on Kayla, but my friend started a business called Charms and Chit Chat. That's her Instagram handle. I highly recommend checking out if you're in New York or the tri-state area, where she basically comes into your home with everything you need to make a charm bracelet or necklace. So I had I think there was 15 people in my apartment, and we all were you pick out your charms, and then we all made them. Making them was stressful for me because I hate crafting, but I felt so proud after that I could say I made this necklace. It was so cool to see everyone's personality come through in the necklace. And it was the first time I ever hosted a full party in my apartment. Back in the day when I still would drink and go out, we would have pre-games, but this was really the whole night as we were staying in. So it was really fun. I ordered a bunch of pizzas. It was a pizza party. My mom came, my sister, my brother's fiance. So it was cool to have family here too. We stayed up literally until 2 a.m. Hysterical laughing. A few of my friends didn't leave until 1:45, and it was just so much fun. Such a good night. And I'm I'm in my party planning era. I'm also heavily planning my 30th birthday party, which is this summer. I'm having a Mamma Mia themed birthday party, and another party I had this month. My mom, my whole life, always had a big party for St. Patrick's Day, and she didn't do it the last few years, really, since COVID. But it was back this year, which was just such a fun night with my whole family. And I told my little cousin, Kristen, who is turning 18 in a few weeks, that I told my whole family, like, just to, like, save the date that I'm having this big birthday party. And my cousin literally said to me, like, I've been waiting my whole life for someone to have a Mamma Mia party. And she has, like, planned the whole thing. Like, she has, like, all the decorations saved. She sent me a Pinterest board. Like, she is planning my birthday party for me. It's been so much fun, like, the last few weeks, just, like, bouncing ideas off of each other and, like, coordinating things. So I'm, like, really in my party era. But I was, like, so busy every weekend this month. And then you guys are here, going to be listening to this on Monday. So, like, this previous weekend, I also was so busy. I'm going home in the morning for Easter, but also, like, my sister's birthday weekend. So with my family a lot, which I love spending time with my family. I need to be alone to be refueled, but I also, like, spending time with my family just, like, really makes me happy and, like, refuels me, I guess. But yeah, I had, like, a really good month. Oh, the biggest thing that happened this month is that I started a new job, which was really great. It's going really well. I'm very happy. I think I might have mentioned this, but I, like, after being unemployed for 7 months, all of a sudden was able to choose between 2 jobs. And, like, the one that I went with is the one that just felt so right to me. And it's just been so nice having that confirmed. I work fully remote, which has been so nice. I'm still, though, like, adjusting to using my brain so much, and, like, I've just been so tired. I think it's, like, also, like, having to get up early and work every day, but, like, allergies and, like, you know, that reverse seasonal depression I mentioned. So I have been tired, but I've been doing so many fun things. Shows I watched this month. I finally, well, Masters of the Air finished, which I'm done talking about, I promise. And then so many people have been DMing me asking if I'm watching The New Look, which is on Apple TV also, which is about the history of Dior, the House of Dior. It's actually, though, no one mentioned this to me, and I didn't get this vibe from the ads, but it's really also about Coco Chanel, and you get to see what the designers were up to during the war and then in the years after. So I caught up. I think the last episode comes out this week. I'm enjoying it, but I have, like, a lot to say, and I think I'm going to next week. It's probably going to be a historical fiction episode because I've been reading so many great historical fiction books lately that I really want to chat to you guys about. And I thought it would be fun to do a bit of a review of the show, The New Look. And then I will recommend, like, fashion, historical fiction, and nonfiction also in that episode. So look forward to that. I also, my favorite Bravo show right now is Summer House. It is just so good. And then I started my Gossip Girl rewatch, I think, in January. But since I'm, like, working from home, I've just been having it on in the background. I just finished season 2, so still enjoying that. I've just been, like, it's been a good month, and I had a really great reading month as well. I had technically it's my second 5-star read of the year, but I'm going to count it as the first 5-star read because the one that was actually the first was The Palace Papers by Tina Brown, which I did on audio. And just because how it was, like, nonfiction and I did it on audio, I feel like it just, like, is in a different category. So I've had my first 5-star read of 2024 this month. It is my favorite book of the year so far. You're going to hear, like, a little bit about it right now, but next week I will be talking about that in full. So I'm going to, if you are new to Professional Book Girl, welcome. On these monthly wrap-up episodes, I kind of just rapid fire go through and give my thoughts on all of the books that I read in the month. Some of them I get a bit carried away and we'll talk a bit more. Other times I will direct you to either, like, an Instagram reel review that I've made on it or a previous episode of the podcast where I've discussed it in full. I kind of will randomly just ramble on longer about some books. This month, though, the calendar screwed me over a little bit because you are listening to this on April 1st, and I obviously have to record before then. So I know I will read at least one more book in March, potentially 2, that I will not be able to review on this episode. So right now, while you were listening, if you want to see what I thought of those books, go to my Instagram page, KRedWhat, and in my highlights, which this is just good to know always, I have a 2024 reads highlight where I keep track of when I do book blank down and on to the next, and I put a star rating there. And then in my reviews highlight, I always put my immediate thought reviews. Little, like, insider knowledge of KRedWhat, I would trust those story reviews I do more than I would weigh them more heavily than I would like any other review that I do, because those are my immediate thoughts. So you're really getting like the raw version of what I think. No thought really goes into it. But go check out those highlights to, I guess, to see. You'll know. I don't know right now. Did I read one more or two more? I don't know. You guys will know, and you can get my thoughts on that book or books then. But I guess without further ado, we have a lot of books to talk about. So let's get into the March wrap up. The first book that I read this month was The Women by Kristen Hanna. This is her latest historical fiction novel. It is about the Vietnam War, and I have already covered this on a full episode of the show, and I have a Instagram reel about it. So I will just leave you with, I gave this 4 stars. I really loved it. I'm really excited that we're seeing Vietnam start to pop up in the historical fiction genre. I hope we get more of it, and I gave it 4 stars. I loved it. You can go listen to a full review somewhere else. The next book I read was Prep by Curtis Sittenfeld, and I realized while I was reading this, I am a little bit of a hit or miss with Curtis Sittenfeld. So the first one I read was Rodham. I read it in 2020. I gave that 5 stars. I really loved it. It is a, what I say, magical realism take on Hillary Clinton's life. It's all about what would have happened if she didn't marry Bill. It was a little raw reading it in 2020, but I really enjoyed it. I also have really loved American Wife, Eligible, which is my favorite by her. I didn't really love romantic comedy, and then I didn't love Prep. I gave it 3 stars, and I honestly, this would have been a 2-star read. The only reason I bumped up to 3 is because the writing is just so impressive. Like, it is so, like, if you've read anything by Curtis Sittenfeld, you just know the way that these books are written, and to me, like, the writing is what kept me from DNFing it. And so that is why it deserves an extra star for that. But I've always been intrigued with this book. And it wasn't until after I read Eligible in November, I was like, okay, let me pick up Prep finally. So this is about like an exclusive boarding school in New England. And I'm rereading Private, which is also a series about an exclusive boarding school in New England. Obviously completely different, because Private is this giant YA series, but it's really funny. I actually the other day did another book, my Private reread, and I was like confusing things. I was like, did this happen in Prep or did it happen in Private? Because Prep is kind of like the adult fiction version of Private. But basically in this book, you follow this student at the school over the course of, I think it's actually like her whole high school experience. I hated her so much, though. Like, she's a scholarship student. She doesn't really fit in with everybody else. She's weird. And like, I just like it basically. Okay, so I'm trying to figure out how I want to talk about it. So like, the way the book is written, it's split up into like giant sections, which is something that Curtis Sittenfeld does a lot, which reading pet peeve of mine. Like, I hate that, because I usually like to finish a chapter before I put a book down. And you can't really do that when the book is like divided into just like 4 sections. But you follow her. I think it's like each section is a semester or something. I don't really remember that part, but it's kind of like each one is like an essay, a giant essay about this girl's time at the school. And she was just insufferable. Like, I couldn't wait to be done with it, because I needed to be out of this girl's head. And I understand that she's like a young teenager. Someone DM'd me, and I'm totally going to butcher what they said, but something about how like she's like, well, she was already through puberty, I'm assuming, but like she was at that phase in life where like your life is just so like insufferable. And that's why reading her perspective was like that, which is a testament to Curtis Sittenfeld's writing, which I already acknowledged. I just like, I couldn't, like, I really didn't like it, because I hated this girl. And like, I'm all for an unlikable character. I don't have to relate to every character, but like, it's not even that she was unlikable. I just didn't like her. Like, I just wanted to be done with this book, out of her head. So it did not really do it for me. But like I said, it was very well written. The next book that I read also didn't do it for me. It is Josh and Hazel's Guide to Not Dating by Christina Lauren. I am a big Christina Lauren fan. I would say that they are more hit for me than miss. This one I have had forever. I feel like you just always see people talking about it when they're talking about Christina Lauren. This didn't do it for me either, though. I think because this is a friends to lovers, and that's not a favorite trope of mine, like, at all. Also, like, so the girl, Hazel and Josh, are like friends, and then they are like living together for a little bit because her apartment floods, and they're like setting each other up on dates. So they're always going on these double dates, but like they're with like they're on a different date. They're not on dates with each other. And obviously like they fall for each other. But Josh is very like, I liked Josh. Like he's very organized and regimented and like has his shit together, and Hazel doesn't, which there's nothing wrong with, but it annoyed me how she was so like, I'm not like other girls. Like she was just like too out there for me, and I just like didn't really enjoy it. And the thing I really didn't like, I can't say because it's a giant spoiler, but I just didn't like it. I gave it 2 stars. Okay, the next book I read, I loved. It is The Exiles by Christina Baker Klein. My favorite book by Christina Baker Klein is The Orphan Train, which I have spoken about on this podcast. I talked about it when I did the If You Like This and You Should Listen, Then You Should Read This episode. This book, though, is so good. So back in the day, some of you may know this, I literally learned this because back when I used to drink alcohol, there is this wine line called 19 Crimes, and it's like based off of these like felons who were sent to live in the penal colony of Australia, and you could like scan the bottle and it would like tell you what the person's crime was. So back in the day, England was using Australia as a penal colony, and they were like using it to like establish Australia. So as they were colonizing the land, they would send their criminals there, and you would like serve out your sentence, and then you were basically like, you could go back to England, I guess, if you wanted, but for the most part, like you were just trapped on the other side of the world, and you would like, that's how like towns and stuff got established. And then obviously like people were sent there. There's like a governor in this book who is sent there to work, to like be the governor, obviously. So that is what, like, we don't learn this in American public schools. So I knew I had that very limited knowledge of it. And then that is what this book is about, though. So our main character, I obviously forgot her name. It's Evangeline, actually. So we meet her as she is a governess for this family in London, and she's like very like well-to-do family. And her dad was a professor, so she was like very well educated, and that's obviously why she's governess. Like she's basically homeschooling these children. So while she was like living in the house with them, though, she was having an affair with the eldest son, who was like the same age as her, and he gifted her like this family heirloom before he went traveling. And basically what happens is one of the other maids in the house is like going through her things, like snooping in her room, and sees the ring and is like, you stole it. And the mom and everyone just like completely convicts her of that. And she is like, I know, like, we think the justice system now is bad, which it is, but like, oh my God, back then. So she is like put in this like horrible jail in London, basically just like convicted without a trial. They just believe the word of her boss over her, and you're with her for a little bit in the jail, and the conditions are just like so horrible. Like there's this one point when she's actually going to be in front of the judge, and like while you're waiting your turn, you're just like locked in these like coffin sized cells. It reminded me of I went to Salem a few years ago, and you can go into like the jail there where they held all the women accused. I'm so tired. I told you guys I can't think straight. Accused of being witches, and those cells are literally just like, you can't even move. So that's what she's in. And she gets sentenced to 14 years in Australia, which is like a very high sentence for this. So we follow her as she goes on the boat, and like not a huge chunk of the book, but there's a decent amount of time dedicated to her being on the boat, which was really interesting because all of these prisoners really like actually ended up having like a bit of freedom while they were on the boat, and she makes friends, and a lot happens that I can't say. And then the rest of the book is about what happens to all of them when they get to Australia. There is so much more to this. Like it might have just sounded like I told you a lot, but that is just skimming the surface. I really love this. It's really at its core, well, like on the surface, it's about like this Australian penal colony, which is just a wild thing in history to read and learn about. But really at its core, this is about strength and like women's strength and female friendships and the bonds that you form. And I just loved it so much. I didn't want it to end. I couldn't put it down. I gave it 4 stars. Next book was my monthly historical audiobook, and it is The Women of Rothschild. So I picked this up. I saw it on Bookstagram, and then I was at Strand and it was on display, so I just grabbed it there. But I knew I was going to do it on audio, and I wanted to read this because the Rothschild name comes up a lot when you read historical fiction. I had just been watching Paris Hilton's show, and her sister Nikki is married to a Rothschild, so I was like, let me learn more about this family. I thought that I gave the audiobook 3 stars because it was a little bit boring, but most of that is because of how this family kept records. So they talk about this in the beginning of the book, but for a lot of time, like for hundreds of years, they only kept record of the women in the family by like their marriage and births. So they cover like one branch of the family. It was like the English branch of the Rothschild family. And it was just a little like the first 3/4 of the book kind of just felt like, oh, and she married this person and whatever. And then they would talk a little bit about like the husbands and like the men come up a lot. When you get more into the last 100 years, that's when it got really interesting because there was just more historical information about what these women were actually doing with their lives. So I do like when I read so much historical fiction that things like real life historic things just come up a lot. And so I do like to kind of like research it so I know a bit more when I'm reading my historical fiction books and it comes up again. So like I said, that's why I wanted to pick this up. I'm glad that I did. It was an interesting story. I just wish that like they did better record keeping and we had more information about more women in the family. But the ones in the last 100 years, they had like wild lives. The next book I read is my favorite book of 2024 so far, and it is The Disappearance of Astrid Bricard. I gave this 5 stars, and I am going to be covering this in full on next week's episode, so I'm not going to say anything yet, but I do have a video review on Care and What if you want like a little bit of a teaser of what I thought about this book, but I loved it so much. I got better than the 5-star feeling. It felt like this book was written for me. I just like absolutely adored it, and I can't wait to gush about it next week. The next book I read was When I'm Dead by Hannah Morrissey, and I gave this 3 stars. I thought that this was fine. It didn't blow me away. This is more of a police procedural than a thriller, which is just always a bit of a harder sell for me. I'm more into like the thrillers than I am about like following the case like as it goes on. I just find those to be a little bit more boring. The premise of this case though was really interesting. So our main characters, they're a married couple and the wife is a medical examiner and the husband is a detective. And they are at their daughter's school play when they're called away because a body has been found. So they tell their daughter, make sure you go home with the neighbor. And then they go to find the body only to find that it is their daughter's best friend who has been killed and all of her teeth are missing. So while they're there though, they like call to check in on their daughter and they realize that she is missing. She didn't listen to her parents and go home with the neighbor, and now no one knows where she is. So the story kicks off from there. That all happens in the very, very beginning. And the parents are trying to figure out who the murderer / kidnapper is, and you just go on a wild ride. You're in both characters' perspectives, and then there's also a third perspective, which I won't say, which I found to be really interesting. I really liked the twist, and I thought the mystery was good. It's just like there was a lot of bits about like their relationship and like the home life, and then like some of the detective stuff is just boring to me. So if you're into police procedurals though, you'll probably really like this one because the mystery is really good. There were great twists. Those are just like historically harder to win me over than a thriller, so I gave that 3 stars. The next book I read was When We Had Wings, which for those of you catching on, yes, 3 books in a row. We're started off with when in the title, which was a very random thing that happened. But When We Had Wings is by Ariel Lahan, the author of our February book club pick, The Frozen River, Christina McMorris, and Susan Messner. I loved this. So I'm pretty sure I've mentioned it on the podcast before, but there's this historical fiction book called The Angels of Baton by Elise Hopper that I read like a year and a half ago, and I Really, really enjoyed that. I never knew about the Angels of Baton before. This book is also about them, but a very different take on it. I'm really interested in the Pacific Theater coming into like our World War II historical fiction. I feel like it just gives like an interesting take on the war. I'll never tire of reading World War II books, but it's fun when there's a little bit of a new like niche that comes up. So if you don't know, the Angels of Baton were these real American Army and Navy nurses who were based in the Philippines before America entered the war. And there's three main characters in this book. One of them is a Filipina nurse, one of them is an Army nurse, and one of them is a Navy nurse. And they're all best friends, and they're basically just like living the life. Like they have a pretty great deployment location. The Philippines is beautiful. It's like they're always on vacation. But when they're there, Pearl Harbor happens, and they're like, oh my God, like we are now at war and Japan is right next door and they are going to be here so soon. So what ends up happening is they are all taken prisoner, and I'm not going to talk about what happens when they're prisoner, but this is like the real historical facts. Like the Japanese did not know what to do with women being there when they came and like they conquered the Philippines, because to them, women didn't belong anywhere in war. So they had no idea how to treat them. So it's a really interesting story which actually happened, which is just so crazy. The three of them have very different experiences, but they're all like obviously similar in a way because they're prisoners of war. But I'm so happy that there is another book about them. They are so inspiring. Their strength is so inspiring. It's unimaginable what they went through. I really, really enjoyed this. I didn't want it to end. And yeah, I think I may also cover this one on another episode because I just thought it was so good. I will say though, I gave this 4 stars, which is what I also gave Angels of the Pacific. So I wouldn't say choose one over the other. I think they're both great. If you're interested in reading about this, just pick up whichever one you can first. The next book I read was Litany by Jessica Mowry. I don't even know when I acquired this book. I've just had it on my shelf forever, and I was trying to set my TBR with like a bit of a nice mix of genres. So I threw this on there. This is a thriller, I guess, but basically it is about a 14-year-old girl who her parents divorced when she was very young, and she always lived with her dad. But when he dies, she has to leave California and move to the Midwest where her mom lives, and her mom is like a very prominent lawyer in this town. It is the 80s. Satanic panic is sweeping the nation, specifically where this girl lives in this town, and she is like really lost. She was so close with her dad. She's very upset that he's died. She doesn't really know her mom. She's looking for any connection. And she starts hearing these kids talk about playing the game. And she becomes intrigued. And we basically learn that her mom has also been investigating this because there's this game happening where children are being abused. And it kind of like all kicks off from there. This had really great twists. I didn't see the ending coming, but if you want to pick this up, do not read the author's note in the beginning of the book. First of all, I think you should always read an author's note, and I have no problem with it being in the beginning of the book, except for this one, because the author talks about how this case happened in her town when she was growing up, and it always stuck with her. And she was like, we learned about it from the perspective of the adults who were investigating it, but never about the kids who were involved, which I was like, so that's why she wanted to write a book like this, so that way it's like finally like giving the children a voice. Totally get that. Love that. Like here for that. Except in the author's note though, she detailed the entire case. So she spoiled the whole book in the author's note, which would have been fine if the author's note was in the back of the book. So I didn't put it together as like when I was first started reading the book. It wasn't until the mystery started all coming together that I realized I already knew everything that happened. So it was really weird, honestly. Like I don't know why the publisher put the author's note where it was. Other than that though, I thought it was like a pretty solid mystery. I gave it 3 stars, I think, because I was pissed that the book spoiled the book for me. But it was like an interesting mystery, and I feel like you don't see as much anymore about satanic panic and thrillers. Like I always go back to Dark Places by Gillian Flynn, which is like one of my all-time favorites, which like satanic panic is such a big part of that. Just So, so good. So if you are looking for something like that, pick this up, but do not read the author's note in the beginning of the book. The next one that I read was Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. This was a reread for me, and I did talk about my full reread experience on last week's episode, so check that out if you want more. I will just say I really enjoyed rereading it. I loved oh my god, I cannot speak. I loved visiting this world again, visiting these characters, and it was such a cool experience that I had with this book that I haven't had with any of the other ones that, because, you know, I've been rereading like childhood favorites and then going through Sarah J. Maas again. But when I was reading this one, it was literally like doors in my brain were opening and I was like repicturing things that happened way later in the series. And it was just like such a fun experience. And I'm really excited to keep going. Next book I read is The Romanov Brides by Claire McHugh. I really love this. So one of my like kind of super, super niche historical interests is the Hesse sisters. And they were 4 princesses who were granddaughters of Queen Victoria, and they were very famous for their beauty, and they all went on to have like very interesting marriages and lives. This book follows 2 of them, Elizabeth and Alex, who both married into the Romanov family. If you are familiar with the Romanovs, you're probably now realizing Alex, meaning the one who married Tsar Nicholas II, mother of Anastasia, Olga, Tatiana, and Maria, who I, in the last like year and a half, have been kind of like slowly really entering my Romanov era. This book, I was asked this, and I will say, if you don't know much about the Romanovs, you can still read this book because half of the story is Alex's older sister, Elizabeth, who married into the Romanov family first. She married Nicholas's uncle. I did not know anything about her. I really enjoyed reading it, and it's kind of funny. Queen Victoria was just such character. And at this point in time, Elizabeth was her favorite granddaughter out of many, 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 many. Like maybe some of you don't know this, but like if you look at like the history of royal families in Europe, like especially at the time in the Victorian times, like she was marrying her grandkids off like wherever she can to make these advantageous matches, and she did not like the Romanovs. She did not want any of her grandchildren marrying into that family. So Elizabeth, Queen Victoria played like a heavy role in Elizabeth's life, but as we know, she did marry into the Romanov family. So, and Queen Victoria is a character in this book. I really love learning about Elizabeth since I didn't know much about her. My knowledge of the Hesse sisters is really just like things that I'm on like history talks, so I'll see like interesting videos about them. One of the other Hesse sisters is Prince Philip, who Queen Elizabeth II's husband, his grandmother. So there's your like tie to modern day royals in there. She was present at the birth, or not the birth, but like the baptism of King Charles. So I just found that to be very interesting. She's obviously a character in this book, but not a main character. It's focused on Elizabeth and Alex. Alex is much younger than Elizabeth, and we follow her the first time she meets Tsar Nicholas, and you follow their courtship, and you're together when they get married, and it kind of like lasts up to when he becomes Tsar. I think I started saying this before and then I cut myself off, which I tend to do, but if you don't know much about the Romanov family, you can still read this book, and I would recommend it because this was the first experience I had seeing Alex and Nicholas together before they're even married, let alone parents, let alone Russian Revolution. So it was really, you know, if you know the full story, and even if you don't, like it's history, it's not a spoiler, but like they loved each other so, so much to the point where Alex potentially and the daughters could have lived if they refused to be separated when the Russian Revolution was breaking out. So it was really sweet and cool to read about their courtship and when they first met and fell in love. And I really enjoyed that. I really liked Elizabeth. I did a lot of research after about her and about the other Hesse sisters, and I'm not going to say anything, but like, oh my God, her life was really, really wild. So this is my favorite thing that happens with historical fiction, when it's like a new to me subject. I had limited knowledge of the Hesse sisters, but I love learning about them through historical fiction. I'm now able to kind of like place them in history, place the name the Hesse sisters to Elizabeth and Alex and these characters, and I just really, really loved it. Claire McHugh also has a book. She kind of like, her niche historical fiction is like Victorian characters, which I am just like a very big fan of because I'm Victorian era is not my favorite. Queen Victoria isn't actually my favorite, but there's so much there that is so interesting, and so many like things always connect back to the Victorian era and all of those or all of her descendants. So I really enjoyed reading that. Oh, and I gave that 4 stars. The next book I read was Bloomsbury Girls by Natalie Jenner. I didn't love this. I guess I would say I liked it. Some parts I was so obsessed with it, and then others I was just like, this is so boring. Like, we need to move on. So this follows all of the people who work in a bookstore in Bloomsbury, which reading it was very timely because a year ago I was on my UK trip and I like had a full day in Bloomsbury. And this takes place in the early 50s. So World War II is over, but London is still rationing and kind of healing from the war. And there's a few main characters, but basically at the bookshop, there's 2 women who work there who are best friends, very, very different lives. Then there's like a few guys, and then like a few like younger guys, and then these like older guys are in charge of the bookstore, and they're very adverse to making any change, which the changes that the women want to make are so obvious. But then one day a new woman comes to work at the bookstore, and the guy, the manager, has a stroke, he has a seizure, and he's like put on bed rest, so he can't be in charge of the bookstore. And they start making all of these changes and kind of like finding themselves while making changes in the bookstore. There's a mystery element. It really is mainly character driven, I would say. There's a bit of a plot, but I don't know. It was just like a little too slow and boring for me. Just like I loved some of the characters, and then the other ones, it was like, I just can't wait to get out of your head. So I give that 3 stars. It just didn't do it for me. The next book that I read was Mercury by Amy Jo Burns. I loved this, and I don't know why I didn't expect to even like it. Like, I got this from Book of the Month, and I remember when I was picking it, I was like, I don't know, I might like regret choosing this, and maybe it'll be a DNF. But I really, really loved it, and I'm glad that I decided to get it from Book of the Month and pick it up. So I saw this being marketed as like a love triangle between brothers, which, you know, I love the Vampire Diaries, so I'm not opposed to that, but that is not really what this book is about. So it is the late 80s, early 90s in this small town in the Midwest, and our main girl is Mallory, and we meet her as she moves to this town of Mercury. I don't know why I can't pronounce that word, where she meets the Joseph brothers. So this family is very prominent in the town. The dad is a roofer and is like known for like fixing everyone's roofs in town. The brothers work with him. There's a much younger brother, Shay, who I loved so much. And she sees him at a baseball game, and she immediately like has an attraction to the oldest brother. But we know that she ends up with the other brother. So it goes back in time. The book opens in like modern time, which was like the 90s, and there's a bit of a mystery element. So like something happens, and then it goes back to before that part of the book is called, and it tells their story from when they met leading up to that current timeline the book opened with, and then the rest of it is what happens after that. What this really is, though, is like a portrait of a family. It is so character driven. Like, there is that mystery for a plot, but that is not what matters in this book. Like, you are with these characters through everything. I love a book about a fucked up family, and that is what this does for you. Like, it is just so good. Like, it's really about how like family bonds and family legacy and reputation, and feeling like you have to live up to the name, which is something I understand, and about the people who marry into the family and just become so sucked up in the history of it and the lore of a family. I just loved this so much. I loved the characters. I loved that because it's so character driven, you really felt like you knew these people and you can understand why things were happening. And it was just so good. And I love that it was told in like the early 90s. It was just like an added thing that I just found really interesting. So I really loved Mercury. If you were like me and on the fence and unsure if it was for you, I would definitely give it a try. I gave that 4 stars. The next book that I read was American Daughters by Piper Hewley, who I'm a huge fan of. I loved her book By Her Own Design, which is about Anne Lowe, the woman who designed Jackie Kennedy's wedding dress. I talked about her in the past on the show because I finally got to see one of her dresses on display at the Met like 2 months ago now. This is her latest book that comes out in April, and it is about the friendship between Alice Roosevelt, who was first daughter, Teddy Roosevelt's daughter. There's a great historical fiction about her life called American Princess, and Portia Washington, who is the daughter of Booker T. Washington. I loved this. I already knew Alice's story, but I loved revisiting it in the context with her friendship with Portia. I loved Portia. I loved following her story. I never knew anything about her. I loved how, it was an unlikely and some might say like forbidden friendship that they had, but they really drew strength from each other, and their lives mirrored each other in so many ways. And I will be talking about it more in depth on a future episode, but I did give it 4 stars. The next book I read was Listen for the Lie by Amy Tintera. I gave it 4 stars, and I'm not even going to get into it because there's a full episode where I talk about it. It was the March book club pick, but I loved it. If you want to know what I thought, go listen to that episode. The next book I read was 100 Other Girls by Aman Harari Kia. I picked this up from the library because I'm in my Libby era, because I knew I was going to that event at Meta, and Aman was the moderator of the talk. So I wanted to read one of her books before I went. I remember seeing this all over TikTok when it came out. This is basically like, people say it's Devil Wears Prada, but it's not really, because it's really about like what goes on at a magazine, especially in the current day. You guys probably don't even know this about me. I grew up wanting to work at a magazine so badly. I think like so many girls in my generation, like my life changed the day my mom handed me a Teen Vogue. I remember, like, I could picture her handing it to me. I wanted that life so badly. And like, just the way the media landscape is now, like, that career just kind of was like robbed of me because of the way that like print media has gone down. So I'm always intrigued by stories like this, but I'm always a bit skeptical because I spent so many years working in fashion and in the industry, and sometimes it's just a little bit like I have the firsthand experience. I'm sure so many of you guys may feel that way when you read books about like what you do for work. So I was a little skeptical, but I actually really liked this. It's about a girl who becomes the assistant to an editor at a big magazine like this, but within the magazine, there is this huge rivalry between print and digital, which I found to be really interesting and like a really great modern take on media. And she finds herself in the middle, and all of this stuff goes down. And it was really interesting. I wasn't obsessed with it. Like, I really liked it. I gave it 3 stars. I loved, though, the way that the author spoke about New York. She has to live near me, because the way she wrote about my neighborhood was so on point and like highlighted all the things that I love about it. And she like was name dropping cafes that I was like, oh, I need to go and try them. Her next book, though, is called The Most Famous Girl in the World. It comes out in September. I actually just got an ARC at that event. I cannot wait to read it. It's like scammer con artist story. It sounds so good, and the cover is so good. So I'm very excited about that. The next book I read was Elvis and Me by Priscilla Presley. I picked this book up after seeing Priscilla, the Sofia Coppola movie, and I saw that movie and I loved it. But when you see any movie based on real life, like, you can assume maybe some things were exaggerated or played up, but it is so impressive, having now read the memoir, like how true to the text Sofia Coppola stuck. Like, I felt like I was reading like the screenplay almost, like, and so the whole time I was reading the book, I was like picturing what happened in the movie. So if you've seen the movie and you don't feel the need to like dive deeper, you might not even, I wouldn't even say like pick this book up, because it doesn't even dive deeper. Like, it is the movie, which the movie dives deep. Like, it is crazy. Priscilla and Elvis's story is just so insane. Like, that would never happen to, it's gross. It's so crazy. But what I want now is, I want to learn more about Priscilla's life after she left Elvis. And I am excited, Riley Keough, who is Elvis's granddaughter, she played Daisy Jones. She is publishing her mom, Lisa Marie's memoir. So I'm really intrigued about that. But it was just like I knew the whole story because I saw Priscilla, but it was so wild to revisit it still. It's a very, very quick read. It's under 300 pages. The way that it's written, like you just fly through it. And the story is just so wild. So even though like I already knew everything, I was just mind blown that everything I knew wasn't exaggerated, if that makes sense. Like it is just, it's crazy. It's so crazy. The next book I read was Confessions, which is the next book in my private reread. I am rereading my favorite childhood series. So this is my second year doing it. I am making my way through Private by Kate Bryan. This one was real. I gave it 4 stars. It was so good because the ending, there's a major reveal. I like forgot that happens there. So really enjoyed that. The next book I read, I literally just finished it, was Unsinkable by Jenny L. Walsh. This is kind of billed as a Titanic book. And an issue I do have with this is the second book, historical fiction novel now, where I've been like, oh, it's going to be Titanic, and Titanic is just a brief portion of the book. But the title Unsinkable is really like the thesis of this book. So this follows the story of a real person, Violet Jessup, who was working as a stewardess on Titanic. She survived, and then she went on. She like couldn't give up life at sea because she was providing for her whole family, and she made so much money in tips when she was working like these voyages. So she keeps going back. She was on boats that sunk 3 times, like Titanic and 2 other times, which is just so crazy. So this is a dual timeline. In Violet's timeline, it is based off of Violet's real life. So you follow the real events, you know, Titanic happens, and then World War I breaks out. So World War I is a part of her storyline. She becomes a nurse. If you know World War I history, a lot of stuff was going on with boats, so that might be a hint for you. Then there is a second timeline, which is a World War II timeline, which I really loved. So the main girl in that timeline is Daphne, and this was like just a fun little like addition that I enjoyed so much. So her dad is like a super famous actor, but he like has never publicly acknowledged her. So she grew up in boarding schools and would like she's seen with her dad, but people don't realize that it's his daughter. And her mom died when she was a baby, so she only has her dad, and she's always like trying to impress him. And it's not cool that he doesn't acknowledge her, but I liked the little tidbit of like, oh, her dad is this famous actor, and it was just like very different and interesting to read about. But in always trying to impress her dad, she is like, she's so smart. She knows all these languages. And, you know, going into World War II, people that were like that were recruited by the SOE. So she goes undercover in France, and you follow her through her SOE training and then undercover in France. And that storyline was just so good as well. Both were so riveting. Sometimes when there's a dual timeline, you'll be like, oh, I want to get back to the other one, but I just did not feel that way. Daphne's timeline is based on real people and events that happened in World War II, but it's not biographical fiction, whereas Violet was a real person and you're following her real journey, which is just so crazy because it seems like truth is stranger than fiction. The way that the 2 timelines crossed over, I loved it so much. I'm not going to say anything, but I highly recommend this book. But if you're scared of like oceans and shipwrecks, like I said, Violet, she gets like the nickname Miss Unsinkable because she's survived 3 ships sinking, and you are vividly with her in those moments, which was just so wild. But I enjoyed it so much. It was so good. I gave that 4 stars, and that is all I have read so far. So if you want to know if I got to read 1 or 2 more books in March, go to my Instagram, KRedWhat, and you will see that there. That is our show. Thank you so much for listening. Please make sure you're following, subscribed on whatever podcast platform you are listening on. Follow me on Instagram at KRedWhat. Follow the show at Professional Book Girl. Our April Book Club pick is Right on Cue by Falon Ballard. So excited to read it with you guys. That episode will be out on May 2nd, and I will see you next week.